And Dave is going to come and read for us from Matthew 21, verses 1 to 11. So, Dave.
Did you get that? Matthew 21, verses 1 to 11. Last year when I read this, I think I asked for your help. When we get to Hosanna, do you reckon we could all join in and say Hosanna? Because that gives us a flavour of what was going on at the time. Jesus comes to Jerusalem as king. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you'll find a donkey tied there, with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed him shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowd answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee."
I always love a bit of interaction. I always love it when Dave gets us to do that. I've got a bit of a confession to make. I am a little bit of a closet royalist. I know that's not necessarily a popular thing nowadays. It does seem to be more popular here in King's Lynn because of our proximity to Sandringham, but quite a few other places I would have received some boos for that. But I do have a bit of a soft spot for our royal family, and I love a bit of pomp and ceremony. We Brits do it so well, don't we? Adrian and I used to live in Essex on the flight path to Buckingham Palace. So if ever there was a fly past, it was fantastic. We would stand in the garden and watch the aeroplanes fly over our heads in formation, and then we'd run into the lounge, and then by the time we got from our garden to the lounge, the aeroplanes have got from Essex to London. They've turned their sort of coloured trails on, and we would watch them fly over Buckingham Palace, and it was really quite spectacular and pretty awesome. But the most recent significant royal event was just last year, wasn't it? The coronation of King Charles III. And we watched on TV all the crowds and parades and thousands upon thousands of people all gathered and cheering and hoping for a glimpse of the king. And then the gates opened, and out he came in that golden horse-drawn carriage. And there were guardsmen and other members of the royal family and all sorts of fancy people in the parade. It was quite spectacular. Did anyone travel down to London to see it in person? No? No? Just imagine for a minute that you did. Imagine for a minute you went down to London waiting to see the king on his way to his coronation. And you're outside Buckingham Palace, And you're all crammed in with the crowds, hoping to catch a glimpse of the king. And then the gates open and you see him riding on a donkey. Worse than that, on a donkey's colt. In other words, a young, small donkey. Can you imagine how ridiculous that would have looked? And in our passage, you see, we're told, aren't we, that this is a donkey's colt. It's not even a full-size donkey. I mean, Jesus' feet must have been almost dragging on the ground. And imagine if at Buckingham Palace, instead of all the pomp and ceremony, instead of all the guardsmen in their big Busby hats and their coats with shiny buttons, what if the king had been followed out by a ragtag bunch of people? Big issue sellers, ex-prostitutes, people who used to be blind, ex-lepers. Do you think people would still be cheering, still waving flags? Or do you think they'd be thinking, what on earth is going on? Because that's pretty much what happened on Palm Sunday. The king came riding into Jerusalem, not in a gold carriage or on a majestic war horse, but on a donkey's colt. And he brought his ragtag bunch of followers with him. So what was really going on? We know, don't we, from reading the previous chapters, the previous passages, that Jesus has been avoiding Jerusalem for a while now. He is persona non grata in a big way, and he knows that if he goes back to the city, he's going to be arrested, be killed. And so Jesus and his disciples have stayed away. But now it's time. It's time for God's salvation plan to be put into action. It's time for Jesus to move. And this act is deliberate on Jesus' part. This is deliberate timing. You see, Jerusalem would have been heaving full. The busiest it gets in a year because it's almost Passover and people are gathering. It's the huge Jewish festival, and faithful Jews travel for miles and miles and miles to gather together and celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. And later in the week, everyone will gather around their tables and will remember how God rescued his people from slavery to Pharaoh in Egypt, how he rescued them and brought them out, how he brought them to freedom and to the promised land. And so Jesus is coming to Jerusalem to make a point, a really serious point, a point that he wants people to notice and to understand. And so there are preparations to be made. Jesus sends a couple of his disciples to a place nearby to fetch a donkey for him. But not just any donkey. This is a young donkey, a foal, a colt, one that has never been ridden before. And as we've said, it wouldn't be a very big donkey. And actually, when he was sitting on the donkey, Jesus' feet would probably have scraped along the floor. The last time I saw a donkey was at the seaside. I think it was when we were in Blackpool. And when I was a child, I used to think that these donkeys were huge, scary things. And I was quite surprised when I saw one fairly recently as an adult that actually even a full-grown donkey isn't even that tall. So a donkey's colt would be even smaller. But Jesus did this on purpose, to fulfill what was written in the scriptures. So if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, keep your finger in this page and turn back to the Old Testament to Zechariah chapter 9. Zechariah chapter 9 contains a prophecy that was written over 500 years before Jesus was born. And this is a prophecy of God moving in power to overturn the other nations and to restore the fortunes of Israel. Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 says this: "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And if we look at the rest of Zechariah chapter 9, it goes on to talk about the king taking away the war horses of the nations and bringing in peace. This is talking about a promised king who rules not with war, not a king coming in on a great charger or a war horse, but a king who brings peace and restoration and salvation. So it's like 500 years previously, Zechariah was saying, when you see this happen, when you see this king riding in on a donkey's colt, then you will know what is about to happen. God is going to move. Things are going to change. But actually, it's the following verses in Zechariah that made me sit up and take notice. Because Zechariah chapter 9, verse 16 says this: "The Lord their God will save his people on that day, as a shepherd saves his flock. They will sparkle in his land like jewels in a crown." You see, and as a Jewish person, this prophecy would have been so special to you. This is what God is going to do. No longer will you be oppressed and downtrodden. You will sparkle like jewels in your land. When the king comes in power, God is going to save his people. And Israel were God's people. They are the people that God is going to save. So when Jesus comes riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, well, of course the people cheered. Of course the people celebrated. Of course this was the most joyous of days, because this is it. This is what you have been waiting for your entire life. This is what your people have been waiting for over 500 years. And it's happening right here, right now, in front of your eyes. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey's colt, and the people know that this is the sign. In the same way that we know red sky at night, shepherd's delight, red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning. We know what it means. We see the signs and we understand. The people saw the sign and they understood this is when God is going to save them. He is going to save his people, Israel. And then you can imagine the scenes. People crowding in and laying down their cloaks on the floor like we would lay a red carpet for an important visitor. And taking branches and palms off trees to lay on the floor for Jesus. And then waving them like flags in celebration. It's an incredible scene, a ridiculous scene. Jesus' head would have barely been higher than the crowd as he rode into Jerusalem on the colt of a donkey. But all the prophecies tie back to the promised king, being one who is descended from King David. And King David was the greatest king that Israel had ever known. That's why the people shout, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Because Hosanna literally means save us. So the people, in response to what Jesus is doing, in response to what they see, in response to the sign that they understand, they are shouting, "Save us, Son of David. Save us, God's promised Messiah." So far, so good. The trouble is, it doesn't stay good, does it? By Thursday night, those voices that shouted Hosanna changed to crucify him. But why? What does Jesus do to cause them to turn against him? Well, actually, it's what he doesn't do that's more of the issue. You see, on Palm Sunday, Jesus deliberately made a statement by riding that little donkey that he was Israel's king. He was the Messiah. He was the anointed one of God. And in our modern language, we understand Messiah to mean God. We say Jesus the Messiah, Jesus God. But actually, it didn't mean that. Not then, at least. Messiah simply meant the anointed one of God. The anointed one of God. And there were lots of people who were called Messiah at various times in Israel's history. People who acted in the Spirit of God to bring freedom. And the most famous of those messiahs would have been a man called Judas Maccabeus. So a very quick history lesson for you. About 150 years before Jesus, it wasn't the Romans that were in power, it was the Greeks that were in power. They'd come in and swept through the land under Alexander the Great when he'd conquered the whole area. But just like the Romans, the Greeks also worshipped lots and lots of different gods. And they'd filled the Jewish temple, the holy temple, God's holy temple. They'd filled it with statues and images and idols and loads of Greek gods and goddesses. And Judas Maccabeus, one day, he led an uprising and he overthrew the Greeks. He kicked them all out of the temple. And for about 100 years, Israel was free. Actually, that's not strictly true. Jerusalem was free. The surrounding areas, not so much. But the people in that place at that time were masters of their own land until the Romans came along, and then they became subject to Rome and the Roman authorities. Judas Maccabeus was, and still is, celebrated as a Messiah. He was a man anointed by God to save God's people, Israel. And now, 150 years later, here comes Jesus, another Messiah, another man anointed by God to save God's people, Israel. And that's why the people were excited. This is what they've been waiting for forever. And the people thought that this was the moment that Jesus was going to act decisively. This was when Rome wouldn't know what hit them. This was going to be when God, through his anointed Messiah Jesus, would boot the Romans out so that Israel could be free again. God would save his people Israel on that day. But that wasn't Jesus' plan. Jesus' plan of freedom and salvation was so much bigger than they could ever have imagined. Jesus' plan of salvation wasn't just for Israel, but was for all people everywhere. And so when Jesus didn't do what the people thought he was going to do, when he didn't lead an uprising, when he didn't do what they expected, what they wanted, they wrote him off as a failure, a trumped-up, jumped-up, self-proclaimed Messiah who wasn't going to do anything about Rome. And that's why they turned against him. So Jesus was crucified as a failed Messiah, just another disappointment, another madman, another nut job who thought he was more than he was. The stupid thing is, Jesus could have defeated the Romans. Of course he could. He could have acted in power and booted them out. Of course he could. And he would have been incredibly popular with everyone. Well, perhaps not with the Romans. But amongst the Jews, he would have been incredibly popular. But instead, he chose to act differently. Instead of saving one nation from their immediate problem, he chose to save the whole of humanity from our greatest problem, which is separation from God through our sin. And instead of simply defeating Rome, Jesus defeated sin and death and all the powers of the devil when he took all of our sin and shame into himself and he nailed them to the cross so that we could all have the opportunity to know God and to live in relationship with God now and forever. See, Jesus didn't do what the people expected. He didn't do what they wanted him to do. He did something unexpected. He wasn't the Messiah they wanted, but he was the Messiah that they needed. See, because God's plans were so much bigger than just one nation, and they are so much bigger than just one church, or just one town, or even just one country. See, God's plan of salvation was for the whole world, but it wasn't what the people thought it would be. And the challenge to us as a church, and the challenge to us as individuals, is to keep believing, keep trusting in God, keep following, and believing that Jesus is at work even when perhaps we can't see it, or when he doesn't do what we want him to do, when it feels like he doesn't answer our prayers. Will we still keep trusting and following that Jesus is bigger than just me, just us, just Cornerstone Baptist Church, and he's bigger than just King's Lynn? Will we trust that God sees the whole picture and he knows the beginning from the end, and that his plans and purposes are so much bigger than we could ever fathom or understand? And so on Palm Sunday, we have this huge parade. The whole of Jerusalem crowded onto the streets, shouting praise to Jesus, shouting, Hosanna, save us. That shout that has over time become a shout of praise. Save us, Jesus. Save us, Son of David. And Jesus was going to, but not in a way that they could ever have imagined. So this week, this Palm Sunday, as we join our voices with the crowd singing praise to Jesus, as we journey this week with Jesus towards the cross and then beyond it, can I encourage you to come with an open mind, to hear these stories, to look at these events, maybe even as if you are seeing and hearing them for the first time. Allow yourself to unlearn some of the things you think you know, and allow yourself to be challenged and surprised by what Jesus is doing. Don't be so sure that you have everything worked out. Allow Jesus to be bigger than your understanding. Allow him to do more than you think is possible. Allow him to be God, Messiah, the Christ. Allow him to be King of your life. Bless you. We're going to spend some time now as we head into this most important, most significant of weeks, praising the King of Kings. And we have time. Maybe we could sing our final song, and then maybe we could go back and do the Hallelujah, Hosanna one again.